So you'll get a notification. All right. Well, thank you all for joining today's webinar. We will be very prompt at ending this at the top of the hour. My name is Jessica Mitch Holmes, and I am the CEO and co-founder here at Momentum. And we run this A Day in the Life series about once or twice a month. And we invite Momentum trained graduates who are out in the world as professional software engineers to come back and share their experience, talk about a day in the life. And really, this is an opportunity for you all to ask your questions of somebody that's doing this job, that made a career change. And so this is for y'all. How the format works is I have a couple prompting questions. I'm going to introduce Taylor, who's our guest today. We'll get the conversation kick-started, but then we'll open it up to Q&A. So if you're tuning in, get ready to have your questions prompted. You can ask a question in two ways. You can use the chat box feature and type in a question, and I'll field that to Taylor, first come type of basis. And then you can also raise your hand with the Zoom feature, and we'll call on you and you can come off mute and ask your question to Taylor as well. So that is the format of today's session, and we're going to go ahead and dive right in. Again, thank you all for being here. So thank you, Taylor, for joining us. Taylor completed Momentum's program as a career changer back in 2019. He came through our program well before the pandemic, before we all knew that the world was going to completely change, and has been working in the industry as a professional software engineer for about 3.5 years now. And so he's got a lot of experience to share. Taylor has worked at a couple different firms, and Taylor and I actually knew each other before he did Momentum. Taylor was a talent acquisition specialist, so working on the other side of things, recruiting folks. And he was a really great supporter of what we were doing at Momentum, and had always been generous of his time, working with our graduates and our students and talking to them about hiring them at the company he was with at the time. And then that conversation one day parlayed into Taylor and I having lunch and him saying, "Hey, I actually want to become a software developer myself." And so Taylor's journey started there, and it's been a great joy watching you, continue to be a champion for Momentum and be a software engineer. So thank you so much for joining, Taylor. Can you talk a little bit about your current role and share a little bit about your background?
Sure. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you for having me. It's good to chat with everybody. So yeah, like Jessica said, I spent about, 10 or so years in the recruiting or talent acquisition space before I jumped into Momentum. And I even actually between career services people working for Momentum, I worked for a brief bit for Momentum, just helping people with their, getting their resumes ready and prepping for interviews and stuff like that. I did that for the few weeks before my Momentum class started. And then our Momentum cohort was, I think, 13 weeks. And then so I completed that about 4 years ago. And then I started working at Relias in the fall of 2019. And then left there to go work for a small company, Sports Business Journal. If you've ever heard of like Triangle Business Journal or whatever city business journal you may be near, it's under that. It's basically that company, but we were working for the sports division, and that was fine. It turned out to not be a great fit, so I was only there for about 6 months. And now I've been at AllCampus as a full stack engineer for the last about 1.5 years. So it has me working using React on the front end, Python on the back end. Python is what I learned in Momentum, Python and Django. Relias was different. The technology I used at Relias was different than what I learned at Momentum, but what Momentum really does is teach you kind of the core fundamentals of software development and web development, so that you can really use those skills in any environment. So yeah, is that good? Does that cover?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Intro?
Thank you, Taylor. So I always like to start with kind of what was your why? Why did you want, like, when you were sitting there, you had a 10-year successful career in talent acquisition. You were already, in the industry supporting, on the human resources side of things. What was your motivation? And why did you know that this was going to be a good fit for you? Can you talk about what you tinkered with, and maybe some of the life moments that brought you to, like, it's time for me to make a big change for myself?
Sure. So I had, in my ventures in the recruiting world, I had, recruited software engineers and IT folks and stuff like that. And quite frankly, saw how in demand that skill set was. And, the salary, the two things of the salaries they were making, quite frankly, and then just how in demand that skill set was. And I had an interest in that world when I was younger. And I took some programming classes in high school with like C++ and had friends who were computer science majors in college when they were learning Java, and was intimidated by it, and it didn't really do it for me back then. But then when things like Ruby and Python started getting bigger, and then platforms like Code Academy and whatever, all those e-learning platforms like Khan Academy and Code Academy, and there's some other big ones now, but I would take like their free offerings of like Intro to Python and kind of learn the very basics, and was like, yeah, I have an interest in this. It makes sense to me. I've always been kind of a math, science, logic kind of person. And honestly, just kind of fell backwards into the recruiting space. It wasn't like a lifelong passion that I had been striving for in the first place. And ultimately came to the conclusion that I didn't really see myself enjoying another, 20 or 25 years of my career in the HR space. And so kind of, especially once I had kids, thinking about, okay, what's the long-term plan? What's going to provide some financial and career stability more so than I have now? As you see with a lot of these layoffs that are going on, a lot of time, and my experience with the company I was at when Jessica and I first met, Automated Insights. I'm wearing my Automated Insights sweater. When companies are going through a hard time, the recruiters are usually the first to go. And so that's not really an ideal world for, family and life stability. And so I wanted to go into an arena where my skills would be in demand. And so that's kind of how I mentally made the shift of, okay, I want to get out of recruiting and into the tech world. Again, like Jessica said, this was 2019 or 2018 or 2019 is when I made kind of the mental decision. And, honestly, the plan was to like wait till we had a kid get out of daycare, save up some money, and then enroll in the course. And then I got laid off. And so plans changed. And fortunately, Momentum had a course starting, I think, a month after I got laid off. And so I just jumped right into that. In part because I had met Jessica, the online version of Momentum and other boot camps like that didn't exist because it was before the pandemic. But, I had met Jessica, I'd met the teacher at the time, the career services person at the time, and seen that my company was hiring people coming out of Momentum, and other tech companies locally were hiring them out of Momentum. And then, not only were we hiring folks straight out of Momentum, as a recruiter, I was recruiting people who had graduated from Momentum, worked at another place for a couple of years, and now I'm recruiting them as kind of mid-level and senior engineers. So that's what really validated for me that, okay, people are learning things they're learning valuable skills at Momentum, and it is a viable career path for people to go through and turn their, really change their life and change their career path. So that's kind of how, I guess the various mental exercises that landed me at Momentum.
I love that story, Taylor. And I think it's so true to so many of the people that we meet along the way. There's usually some sort of pivotal life moment. and you were thinking really strategically about this next phase of your life. I think when we had lunch that day that you were deciding to do this, weren't you and your wife expecting your second child?
We had just had our second child.
You just had your second child. Oh,
And
yes.
I had just gone back to work.
That's right. That's right. So, and that's so true of so many of the people that come through our program are at some sort of that pivotal crossroads in their life. There's some big reason for them to step back and say, okay, really, what do I want to do next? So with all of that in mind, I have one last question before I really do want to open it up to everybody that's participating today and has tuned in. And this is on theme of the title of this webinar, which is a day in the life. So can you talk a little bit about what the realities of your day-to-day life look like? How often are you in meetings or going into an office or working from home? And how are you able to balance this career with that home life and your two kids and all of the other things that are going on?
Sure. So yeah, I'll try to give maybe a week in the life, right? Because some days it's like I have my meeting days and I have my non-meeting days. The non-meeting days for me at this company are like, we have a 15 or 30 minute stand up where we basically just talk about what we did yesterday, what we're doing today. And that's it. And so that's really nice that my day is not bogged down with meetings or anything like that. And honestly, I've told both this employer and the last place I worked during the interview process of, look, we're still, this is about a year ago, year and a half ago. So the pandemic was a little more upon us and unpredictable. But, I told them in the interview process of my days, I'm happy to work outside of these hours, but like I can't do meetings before 9 and I can't do meetings after 4 because of daycare, kid, whatever stuff. And I've never got any pushback on that. So, I make kind of what people call work-life balance or family life or whatever a priority, like in the interview process, so that they know, if I got to jump for, out of a meeting or because my kid's sick, like we have young kids and that's just how it goes. And I've never gotten any pushback. I mean, maybe I've just gotten lucky with really nice bosses, but I've never had any pushback on that, which has been really nice. So outside of like on normal days without a lot of meetings, you work on whatever you're working on, whether it's fixing a bug. If it's fixing a bug, then a lot of fixing a bug is figuring out first what the bug is, what's going on. And so that's reading error messages in the various places, whether that's in your web application or in a console or in some sort of error logging location that your team has set up for their production environment. Really trying to replicate that on your local setup so that you can have a little more control on what's going on and triggering the error. Because really, if you can trigger the error on your local machine, then you have a good idea of what's going on. And once you have a good idea of what's going on, you're better set up to fix it. And that doesn't always involve writing a lot of very fun or sexy code. It's printing, it's console logging. It's again, you're just trying to see how the data is moving through the application, what the data is, and where it's not working, right? Where is maybe one end expecting something and another end, and the other end is not delivering that something in the expected way. And so bug fixes can be easy that way. It's where it can be difficult, don't get me wrong, to figure out what's going on. But a lot of times it can be a simple change. The other typical thing we work on is like, what folks will call like a feature, or maybe you're adding a page or you're adding something. You're not trying to fix something that broke, you're building something. And that's usually you still have to go through the exercise of kind of what's going on and wherever you're maybe adding your page or building your page, or you're adding on to something that already exists or whatever. but that's usually the more fun part of actually writing new code, and then you build a component or a button or a page or something like that. And you can there's certainly opportunity there for being creative. Chances are what you're tasked with building already exists somewhere, either within your own app or on the internet somewhere. So it can sometimes be an exercise of copy and pasting a lot of the time. And so it's basically figuring out what you want to build and figuring out how it best fits into your app so that it will obviously show up the way you want, and working with the product. Like, we answer to product managers or product owners. They're basically the ones who tell us what they want and what they want it to look like and how they want it to function. And so, if we ever have any trouble with building it, or with some technical limitations of, okay, well, you want it to do all these things, but it, like, the way the system is set up, it can't do all these things. If it can do A, B, and C, is that good enough? And so there's a little bit of a negotiation that can go on. So that's, something that happens. And then adding tests are kind of the annoying thing that people don't like doing, but is a pretty important aspect of things, because if I'm adding a button or if I'm adding something on a page, I have to make sure that it doesn't break things in some place that I'm not even thinking about. Because, a lot of times you can build a component and it's maybe just a simple button, but it's used, apps can often reuse components, because they're, you don't want to just write the same code over and over again. You build it once and then you reuse it in a bunch of different places. So you got to make sure that if you make changes to that button, it doesn't break other parts of the app. And the apps are so big and complex that you can't kind of manually go in and check it and test it. You hope that you have a good testing environment set up so that you can just run the test and it'll tell you if it breaks. So yeah, and then you go through the motion of just whatever your kind of delivery and QA process is. You put out a PR, it usually gets reviewed and approved by your team, and then it goes to a QA person for testing, and then maybe a final review by a product person to make sure that it actually works. And so that's kind of the day or the week in terms of like not getting bogged down in meetings. Other times we have meetings where we have like planning meetings or retros where we talk about what went well over the last sprint and what didn't go well and what things maybe we should change, or, and then there's just the normal, like, company all hands meetings and stuff like that kind of all positions get bogged down with. But is that a good overview?
I appreciate reframing it as like, there's not really an average day. It's really, what do I have to accomplish within a week's time? Because all of these projects and testing and deployment of your code, it kind of happens more, you don't conquer the world in a day.
Right, exactly.
So that's a good reframing of it. So I want to open this up to everybody that's tuned in to ask questions. So again, to everybody tuning in, there's 2 ways to ask questions. You can raise your hand, unmute, and actually talk your question out. Or if it's easier for you, you can type in a question on the chat, and I will field those to Taylor. I think we already have Jessica. Go ahead and you can unmute and ask your question, and thanks for getting us started.
Hi, thanks for hosting this. I have kind of a 3-part question, so I don't know if you want me to ask it all at once or just one at a time.
You can fire away. Just make sure I double check me at the end to make sure I get all 3 parts.
I'm going to ask a controversial question, which is, how long did it take you to get your first job as a software engineer?
I mean, that's not controversial. I graduated early May, and I think I accepted an offer in mid-August.
That's pretty good.
Thank you.
What was it like getting started at your first job? Like, how long did they expect you to be primarily learning at that job? And what tasks did they have you doing, like, in the beginning of your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I started at Relias, like I said, which is, for those of you who may not be local to RTP, it's a learning platform. At the time, they had about 800 people here in the RTP area. And they had a lot of experience hiring hiring people straight out of school, let's call it, for lack of a better word, whatever educational institution that might look like. They had hired people from Momentum. They had hired people from like community colleges with associate's degrees, and they would hire people with bachelor's degrees from four-year colleges. So they have a lot of experience with new people. And because of that, there was a pretty robust training process in terms of, well, and by that, I mean, they had me watch a lot of videos, which, I mean, kind of sucks, but it also introduced me to a lot of stuff. I had an onboarding buddy who I could always ask questions to, and who I regularly ask questions to, all the time, really, because there's always more to learn, right? All the caveats of like, you're always learning. There's the apps are so big that, there's always going to be new parts in the app that you may be tasked to work on, or you might just be building something new. And oh, by the way, like, not only is my onboarding buddy simply more senior than me, and he's just been in the field for longer, but he's also learning, and he's also trying new things. And so he's trying to implement these new things that he's learning. And I don't know anything about the stuff that he's learning. I barely know like how to center a block on a web page, and because that can be really hard. So I was in a good place for that, because they were familiar with people with no work experience. And so they were very comfortable with me slow rolling my experience. And so once I got done with like the first wave of training videos and stuff like that, they would ask me to do really small tasks, like change the font on a page, or change the color of a button, or fix this stuff, because those things are easy, but they don't want more senior developers to do those things, because senior developers make more money. And so it's more expensive for senior developers to do those easy changes. So they want senior developers and mid-levels to work on harder things that are more important for the product. And so there's always like a bucket of these really small tasks that don't take a lot of time, but still involve a developer creating a branch, figuring out the change, making the change, and then it going through that process I described earlier of putting out a PR, going through QA, going through so all that stuff takes time. And that's why the seniors don't do those really small tasks, is because we want the seniors and the more experienced people doing the really big tasks. And so, but as an entry-level person, that kind of stuff gets me familiar with the larger application, even if I'm only making a small change, because now I at least know where things are and how things talk to each other and how the different parts of the application work together. So again, like the more experienced people who have been working on that application for 5 years, they already know all that stuff. So they don't get any value of making those small changes, but I get a lot of value because now I know how the pages kind of work together. Does that make sense?
That absolutely makes sense. Thank you. I have other questions, but I'm going to pass it on and raise my hand later. Thank you.
All right. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Jessica. And real quick, can you just share some context? Are you learning to code on your own? Are you looking for a job? Oh no, we can't hear you.
Muted.
I think you're muted, or your audio is not working on your headset.
There we go.
That's
sorry. I just muted everything because I was done with my turn and I didn't want to make a bunch of sound. So I'm actually partway through the boot camp at Thinkful right now. This is actually part of my learning module to really do meetups and talk to other engineers and really get out of the circle we're in right now and talk to people outside.
Cool.
Jessica, that makes a big difference. Glad that you're here and asking questions.
Glad to be
I'm
here.
going to go ahead and toss over another question that we got in the chat from Michelle. So Michelle is in the process of migrating from corporate banking into tech. So she's making the leap and just finished a boot camp. and wants to know, Taylor, what strategies you recommend for getting your first job. And you're well positioned to share this between your talent acquisition background and doing this yourself. So take it away.
Whew, that's a big one. That's a big one. I could take the next 30 minutes talking about that. But really, it comes down to getting out there and meeting people. And again, I say that with all the caveats of like the pandemic is still like a thing and people may be hesitant, but I think that's a little less scary than it was a few years ago. I mean, I had this, I talk about this exact subject a lot with the Momentum recent grads, and a lot of times I'll show them the calendar, my calendar of like when I first graduated, all I would do was apply to jobs. And then like after about apply to jobs online, and that's it. And after about 2 months, I got actually rejected from a job at Relias. And so I graduated in early May. This is July 4th weekend. They called me right before we were like about to go on vacation and said that I didn't get the job. And I had no other opportunities cooking at all. And that's not a good place to be in. And, again, I'm 2 months out and I have no other interviews lined up or anything like that. And I definitely had a big, oh shit moment of like, this whatever I'm doing isn't working. And so that's when I told everybody. I told my neighbors, my dad, and my parents had people like, whoever they knew in this area that might be somewhat adjacent to tech or not. I mean, it doesn't even have to be adjacent to tech, because you don't know who like your friends know. So like once I just got over myself and was just like, I need help and I need who might in this industry that I could talk to, because their company might have a tech job that I could work for, that I could apply to. You never know where that's going to lead. And where that led me is, again, like July 3rd, I had no prospects. And after about a month of really humping it, and like you drink a lot of coffee, right? I mean, you meet all these people for coffee and lunch and whatever, just to learn about their company. Because if you just talk to them about their company and say, hey, I'm interested in, positions that you might have on the tech side of your company, they'll a lot of times they'll go to bat for you. And if they don't have any opportunities, then, well, you've just met this new person who, you have a good conversation with them. They know that you're a nice enough person to talk to, and they have a whole other entire network that now you have access to, at least some limited access to, right? But you can at least go on LinkedIn and like kind of see who they're connected to. And then you can ask them for introductions of, well, this person works at that company. Would you be open to like, sending an intro email between me and that person so that we can have coffee? And then it just kind of spider webs from there. That was the name of the game for me. And that's, again, I didn't have anything. I got rejected from Relias July 3rd. And then by mid-August, I had, I accepted the Relias offer, but I had two or three very promising things going, like second stage, final stage interviews, kind of almost reaching that offer stage. So that was what worked for me.
Great tips from your experience.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I interrupted you. Just gonna say that was like a really really well explained strategy, because usually that's like the comment that I hear from my friends that are in tech, and they're all, oh, you have to do networking. Yeah, but how? Like
Right.
this is a really interesting. So thank you, because this is a great advice. I got the online bootcamp, but I feel that I don't know if this is like the imposter syndrome, but I feel like I'm still lacking like knowledge to land my first job according to the things that I'm seeing in entry level positions. So that's why I was like finding meetups online, first to meet people, and second to see like schools or places like what are like extra courses that they could be giving, which is like why I'm here, like trying to make this connection. So this is like really great. Thank you so much. I appreciate your answer.
You're welcome.
Awesome. I'm going to tag onto that really quickly. And then Brian, you're next. I see your hand. And Michelle, and for those of you that are doing some online education on your own, learning how to code through those methods is fantastic. It's a great way to get started. A boot camp like Momentum, what we do here is really about making sure that you're career ready. And so we do a lot with working on teams and making sure that you understand not only the code, but then how do you apply that on a live team, and how do you think about building product, and how do you apply agile, and all of those tools that you're going to need to be able to put to work in a career. And that's one of the reasons we have such great relationships with employers and have built them over the years since Taylor has graduated too. People like him being out in the world doing great work help employers come back to a program like ours to seek new talent. So building your network.
I'm sorry. Can I put my email over there and you can help me to like get this information, because I'm really interested in exactly what you said?
Absolutely. Yeah. And anybody on the who wants more information from us and wants to stay in touch, drop your email in the chat and I'll follow up. And with that, I want to turn it over to Brian, who's got his hand raised. And Brian, I think we all know you. I don't see your face. There you are. Hi.
Oh,
Hey.
it's so good to see you, Brian.
Good to see you too. Yeah, so I just had a question because, I know you're doing the full stack thing. So what in your day-to-day what's your breakdown between front end and back end work? And, do you kind of work on both? And if so, like how do you deal with the context switching between like doing front end work and then, maybe doing API work?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I started at this job, it was mostly front end work, but then we were going through the process of like migrating from an old legacy system to the new platform that our team was building. And so we had to get some front end pages built and looking the way they needed to look. And then we had to make sure the system could handle basically the load coming on from that new system, or coming from the old to the new, because the new system was built with only like one client in mind, and now we're going to load it up with like 50. And so everything slowed down, like pages would crash because there was just too much data and all that kind of stuff. So I definitely have a more front end lean, and that's what I would prefer to work on. I think just because I would rather be able to kind of visually see the changes that I'm making in the work that I'm doing, as opposed to like working in database tables. And yeah, it just sounds awful. So, but I've been really forced to work in the back end a lot. And thankfully, the more experienced developers on our team are more experienced on the back end side. So there's a lot of people I can go to for help. And I ask them a lot of questions, and, conversely, they'll ask me for questions about front end. So, it was probably, it was definitely mostly front end for the first few months. The last few months, it's been mostly back end work. I like the aspect of being able to see that whole picture, because I feel like people who are more experienced or more back end or front end oriented will try to solve all problems with that one way, right? Like some problems can be solved with a line of code on the back end as opposed to 200 lines of code on the front end, and vice versa. And so like, I'm not an expert in any of it, but I at least have a good feel of, okay, if this is my problem, then I need to look on the front end. If it's more of a data problem, then I need to at least start looking at the back end. As opposed to just always kind of be focused on trying to fix on one side or the other.
Nice. Thanks, man.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Brian.
For those who don't know, Brian and I worked on our final project together about 4 years ago. So
yeah, old friends.
Yeah, exactly.
The mustache has made it.
Oh yeah. That's here to stay.
Awesome. All right. We've got another message from the chat. Can you give some advice for people who have found who tend to freeze up in interviews? So this is from somebody who's tuning in, and I don't want to mispronounce the name, but This person's mentioned, I have a portfolio and lots of experience, but lately I haven't been able to perform well in live interviews. It's hard to anticipate every question they may ask. This is such a common interviewing. What I want you all to know, and I hope you hear from this, is interviewing is a skill within itself, and it doesn't always map to being able to do the job well. Like an interview is not what you're not in that experience every day on a job. So this is very much a real thing everybody deals with, and it takes its own skill set and own muscle to develop. So I really appreciate this question, and you're not alone in feeling that way. Taylor, what advice do you have?
Yeah, like you said, interviewing is a skill, and skills can be learned. So, if you played sports or whatever growing up, you would go to practice. And so it feels weird, but interviewing is a thing that you can practice. So what I would do to prepare for interviews is write down 10 questions or so, and, make them generic, a lot of times interviews are broken down into like a culture interview and then a technical interview. The culture interview questions are like, tell me what type of team size you like to work on, or what's your management style, or how do you like to be managed, or what do you do for learning and development and training, and tell me about it. And then those like, give me a past example type questions, like tell me about a time where you failed, or you had a disagreement with a teammate and you had to resolve it, or you did something wrong and had to fix it, or that kind of stuff. You can think of 10 or so of those types of questions, write down the answers, say them out, practice saying them out loud. And because the written word kind of looks different than the spoken word sounds, and you might love how an answer or a response reads, but if you don't like how it kind of flows when you say it, then rewrite it and practice it. And if you write down 10 or so, you're probably not going to get too many questions outside of that bubble that you can at least, if you do get a question that's different, you could probably still work in one of your practiced answers, so that at least your answer is a little rehearsed. And the more rehearsed it is, the more comfortable you will be when you hear it, because you'll hear, tell me about yourself. And then if you've already got that practice, you don't have to think on your feet. And because really, when you get something that you're not prepared for in an interview, that's when you really get nervous. And that's when you kind of clam up and you kind of freeze a little bit. But if you're prepared, or you have some answers or some stories worked out in your head of, okay, these are the things, these are my go-to stories or anecdotes or examples that I'm going to use in my interview. Yeah, over the course of like a half-day interview, you might get some that you're not familiar with, but you'll at least have something to work with. Now, the technical stuff, like Jessica said, there's tons of like memes on the internet of like, this is how hard it is to go through the tech interview, and this is what the job really is, right? I mean, like all the interviews I've gone through have been way harder than the actual job. And interviews, in part, I think it's just because people don't know how to interview, and they're also asking the interview to do a lot of things, and that's part of the reason, quite frankly, I got out of the recruiting space, is because I thought interviews were really screwed up, but I don't know how to fix them. And so I just said, F it, and I bailed. So I just went into tech and got out of that mess. But it's like, during the course of an interview, the company is trying to see if if you've actually done what's on your resume. And then they want you to see if your skills will translate into skills that they can use. And like, that's what people haven't really figured out how to test for yet. And so that's why you'll get these obscure coding challenges of write me some random algorithm of how to make it to the other side of America in 5 days, and like what path city do I need to go to? And they're just like, no question I've ever been asked in an interview has ever been like a problem I've solved at work. They've always been way harder. But that's like, they use these as kind of like weed out questions, where if you don't know how to do this, then they just don't bother. And because they can find someone who does, even though, a lot of the everyday job involves, like I said, talking to the product people and kind of negotiating with, well, it involves those kind of interpersonal skills. It involves writing tests. I've never had to write a test during an interview. And, there's not a good match of what you do on a day-to-day basis to what they interview for. And, I mean, if you've ever been involved in interviews or been on interview teams, you've probably seen this firsthand where like somebody will walk into a meeting, hasn't even looked at the resume of the person they're about to talk to. When I was a recruiter, like, again, like literally 5 minutes before an interview is starting, another developer or a manager will be like, do you have like a list of questions I can ask? And I'm like, no, I don't. Like, just prepare, try. And so like, interviewing is not something that people really like to do. And so they don't invest time in preparing for it. And so that's why I just say, like, you just got to practice. Like you can Google and easily find like simple interview questions that you can use to practice. Use platforms like Code Wars, or I mean, there's probably a ton of them now, but there is some just level of rote memorization that you might want to do of like JavaScript data types and that kind of stuff, and use things like Hacker Wars or Leak Code or whatever. And that stuff sucks, and it's not representative of the job, but it's what you get asked in interviews. So that's one of the things you just need to practice.
Yeah, Hacker Rank, I think, is maybe the tool you were mentioning. But also remember, I think it's always helpful to remember that, to Taylor's point, you're meeting with another person, and it's okay, like, to have a human connection, and it's okay to be like, I'm really nervous. I think people really do. They're rooting for you and they want to be helpful to you. And it is, at the end of the day, an interaction with another person. And if you can just remember that, and remember what Taylor mentioned is like, that other person is also taking time out of their day to meet with you, and they might not be fully prepared. And so if you can like let go of any of the assumptions that you have or anything you've built up in your mind about the importance of this meeting, and try to just find a human connection, that can be a really good way to let your nerves down a little bit and find your center and be ready to answer the questions as they come at you. So a lot of it, to Taylor's point, it's practice, it's a skill, you'll get there. And you just have to keep going after it. I know.
And it's another reason to like go out and meet people, because like if you reach out on LinkedIn and at a company you want to work for, and you have coffee with someone, and you can have coffee with anybody. They don't have to be like someone on the tech team or someone in HR or anything like that. Have coffee with a marketing or salesperson, because those people love to talk, and it's like their job to have people or have coffee with people anyway. So like, go out with them. They'll ask you the same questions that you'll get in an interview. And they'll ask you, I mean, especially if you're like a career switcher, they'll be like, oh, that's so interesting. What made you decide to do a career change? Or like, what was it like to go through your boot camp? What were some of the things you learned? They won't necessarily ask you like, tell me about a time you failed, but they'll ask you like, basically tell me about yourself questions, and think of that as practice. That's kind of another motivation to go out and meet people, because you'll get those same interview questions in a less stressful, lower pressure setting. And so you can kind of practice saying those answers in a lower stakes environment.
Great advice. Yeah.
And yeah, like if you get a question that you're totally baffled on, just say, that's a really good question. Can you give me a minute while I kind of think about that? I've never been asked that before or thought about it that way, or something like that. And then just think out loud. Well, I'm wondering if I should approach that problem this way. Does that sound like it's on the right track? And because, yeah, it's like Jessica said, these are people. And the quicker you can break down that kind of formal interview boundary and just have a conversation with a person, they'll be more comfortable and they'll like you more. And they'll give you like a better, I have heard managers come out of an interview of like, well, they technically got this question wrong, but they walked me through how they thought about it, and that made sense. And like, they get value for that mark. It doesn't always have, because I'll push code and it'll break shit all the time. Or not all the time, but like it has broken shit, and like people mess up. And that's okay. It's like, you know, as long as you kind of have a good attitude and don't get too bent out of shape about it, they want someone who's good to work with, most importantly. And if you can like prove to them that you're like a nice person, then that goes a long way.
Yeah, for sure. So I hope that was helpful, Kaylin. Jerome, we've got another question. Go for it.
Yeah, first of all, I wanted to kind of piggyback off what Jessica had said about momentum, teaching how to work on teams, because I'm a recent momentum graduate, just had an interview yesterday, and people were impressed that I was familiar with Agile, Scrum, sprints, things like that. So I just wanted to piggyback off of that. But my question for you, Taylor, is as a career switcher, and like most of us here probably are, and you have a background in recruiting, how can I leverage previous experiences that weren't software engineering related? How can I use that to stand out in an applicant pool of, you know, dozens or hundreds of people who may all have kind of entry-level skill sets, but hey, I'm a guy who has a proven track record of showing up to work every day and being a good teammate and things like that.
Yeah, that's where, I mean, again, I hate to keep harping on this, but that's where like your network is going to matter more, because like, you know, as you apply to a job online, your resume won't really stand out that way. It's hard to get that experience across just as you're one of 100 resumes, because your resume might not even get looked at. The recruiter might just, like, as a recruiter, you might, you know, if you have a job, you might just go through the first 20 resumes. And if you can find 5 good resumes, then you kind of set up those people for calls, and then you move on to the next job, and you don't even look at the next 80, and you might be in that next 80. So don't spend too much time but then, like, you know, I also have to make my resume not look like I'm too old, right? Because ageism is a thing, and like, recruiters can be a little biased towards younger people. And so you don't want to put too much kind of real world businessy experience on your resume. And so that's kind of a tougher needle to thread. And so that's why, again, you want to just kind of focus on people who know those things about you, right? So talk to those people and see who else they know. Like, almost every company nowadays like has some sort of software or tech or you know, some aspect of their business that is tech oriented, that like would be that you have applicable skills for. So like literally everyone is a potential person you could, I mean, Momentum just had a guy who spent 20 years in the railroad industry, like, go through their class, and now he works at a railroad. Like, I never would have imagined that type of a scenario, but he found like the perfect job, right? Like, there is railroad software is not something that I knew about before I met him, but like everything has software as somewhere in its supply chain or in its life cycle, right? So talk to people who know those things about you. They don't, you know, they don't necessarily have to be, you didn't have to work directly with them, but like, again, this is where you kind of can look around on LinkedIn to see who knows who, and just kind of work it that way of, you know, I worked at this place, or I see that you know this person who knows that I have these skills. You know, can I tell you about what I have just been working on? And, you know, y'all have some tech jobs that I might be a fit for. And, you know, can we chat about it?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. That makes sense. Thank you.
Yep.
Great question. I just want to do a quick time check. We're about 8 minutes until 1 o'clock Eastern. So we probably have time for 1 or 2 more questions. And of course, you say that and a hush falls over the crowd. Jessica, you got it again. Go for it.
Hi. I've been asking this of everyone, and the answer they give me is you don't. But how do you really cope with and deal with or disregard imposter syndrome? How do you like because it's been such a huge issue for everyone that I talk to in this industry, because I know that everything is constantly changing and every developer is constantly learning. So how do you kind of like take that imposter syndrome and like absorb it and utilize it? Do you have any strategies that we could use?
I don't know. I just accept the fact that I don't know everything and I move on. I mean, I'm quite aware that I barely know anything. I mean, my kids remind me of that almost on a day-to-day basis. So, I mean, I don't try to learn everything. I know, like, I just try to solve the problem in front of me, I guess, and don't worry about all the things that I don't know, because it's impossible to know everything, right? And like, yeah, tech is changing a lot and there's always new languages, and now there's open AI or whatever all that stuff is, but like, I have a ticket that I need to like get done this week, and I try not to worry about all the other noise, which can be hard, right? Like if you're searching for a job, then you want to try to learn all the things, but that's impossible. You can't do that. You just focus on some fundamentals. The job search is a mental grind more than it is an intellectual challenge. And it's just, block out time to apply to some jobs online, because I think that, you can get lucky, but then block off time to reach out to people on LinkedIn, or to walk around your neighborhood and talk to people, or just go to other places where people are. Get outside. Like, you can't just stay on your computer all day, right? I mean, you got to get outside and walk the dog, or just, again, walk around the neighborhood. Because yeah, you can't just apply to jobs or try to do applications or weather applications so that you can try to learn PHP or whatever new JavaScript framework just came out last month, or working on your OpenAI prompts. I mean, you have no idea what language you might be working in. So that, focus on the basics, just the fundamentals, but focus more energy, not on learning the tech basics, but on just getting your name out there and telling people that, what you're about, and getting in front of people.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Good question, Jessica. And we are going to continue to do this series. We run this about once or twice a month. So continue to tune in and ask our grads of their experience as you continue to get involved. All right. I'm just looking at the time. I'm going to turn it over to Kaylin for the last question, and then we'll wrap up the session for today. So the question is, what main skills are expected of a full stack developer? So I'll just let you take that question.
I mean, that's kind of a big question, but full stack developer, for those who don't know what that term even means like you're working on what you call the front end of the application. And that's like, if you go to facebook.com, that's what you can see. And then the back end of the application is the database. So think of like a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, I guess, depending on how old you are. But that's kind of where the data is stored. And so the back end technology is what basically it's how the data from the database gets to the front end. And then the front end is kind of what that looks like and how it kind of moves around the application. Front end applications almost inevitably require some JavaScript. There's a lot of back end languages. And there's a lot of front end, what they'll call frameworks or libraries. But again, it's like all based on JavaScript. So you can go a long way just on JavaScript. So maybe if you're going to learn like one language, learn that one. There's a lot of different backend languages that are popular. Python, of course, but C# and Java are also enormously popular, and they're older, but like tons of companies use them. So they're everywhere. So, I mean, you could try to learn those, but yeah, just think of like backend is how the data moves from the database to the front end. And then the front end is kind of determines how your data looks, like where the buttons are and where the pictures are and stuff. and words and stuff like that. Is that, Brian, is that good? Is that a good overview? Were you listening? I caught Brian tapping.
Of course I was listening. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good breakdown.
All right, good, thank you.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, that was perfect timing. Thank you, everybody who tuned in. Couple housekeeping items. If you want us to make sure you're on a list for future events and to stay in touch, put your email in the chat box and we will follow up. Also, LinkedIn is a great way to connect. Taylor, I'm sure, would love to connect with you on LinkedIn, and you can continue following his journey and stay in touch with him, as well as Brian, who said some words or who asked a question, and Jerome, who's a recent Momentum graduate. So if while we have a couple minutes to keep the chat open, if you all wouldn't mind dropping in your LinkedIn profiles so everybody can connect and continue this community after we close out for today. And of course, I have a last plug for Momentum. We have one more program left this year that completes within the calendar year. So we have our next program kicks off on July 10th. We are actively vetting candidates and accepting applications for that program. That program graduates in October of this year, and it's the last program of the year that will have a group coming out at the end of the calendar year. Taylor did mention that there's, of course, a lot of headlines right now happening in tech around layoffs. I do want to address that head on. We are certainly seeing that, but to Taylor's point earlier, they're happening mostly on the support side of the business. So human resources, marketing, those type of functions. We're not seeing a lot of turnover on product. So people that are building product, software engineers, those skill sets seem to really still be in demand. And from all of our resources and the people that we connect with, we think that hiring is going to kick back up in Q3, Q4 of this year. So something just to know about the industry, and Momentum would love to be a resource for you. Please continue to follow us, and I hope to see you on a future webinar. And that is it. That concludes our session. Big round of applause, and thank you to Taylor for spending your time sharing your experience with us today. Again, my name is Jessica Mitch, co-founder and CEO of Momentum. Follow me as well, and we are rooting for you all, and thank you for the participation.
All righty. Thank y'all. Y'all have a good day.
Thanks,
Thanks.
everybody. Thank you, Taylor.
Thank you. See ya.
Bye.
Bye.